having worked with that a few years, it was clear that the things didn't really add up, right? The people who were attracted to these kinds of projects were a very different kinds. There were a lot of people who were attracted to the spiritual side of it, but who had a very limited capacity to grasp the complexities of critiquing society and using your sociological imagination through co-creative processes, to reshape society and to ultimately revolutionize it. There was a chasm between people who are more mind people, like more complex thinkers, and people who were perhaps more spiritually developed, right? Among the spiritually developed, there were also recurring problems that people would feel and be inclined to have different sorts of magical thinking. If we just do this, or if we just follow our hearts, stuff like that, right? Or there's a synchronicity, there's a destiny to what we're doing, and so forth, right? And well, also insisting perhaps on introducing topics like energy work, not just metaphorical energy, as in sensed energies in the body and mind and so forth, but that you literally believe that there are energies and fields that you can manipulate or be part of, etc., or different forms of magical thinking in that sense, right? Which did not, in my mind, feel compatible with a modern worldview, with a scientific, rational worldview, so to speak, right? That were clearly pre-rational. So all of that shows up, right? When I try to gather people around, okay, let's gather the integral people, let's organize them, let's make them self-aware as a group and a force in society for society's development. So this chasm got me thinking, well, maybe at least we should have those two different forms of development. That complexity of mind seems to be very well described by a model of hierarchical complexity, but it says nothing about spiritual experience. It says nothing about the state you're in, about being in deep resonance, about feeling that clarity, or the stuff that you can experience through meditation or psychedelic experiences, or sometimes through sexual experiences and so forth, or romantic moments that kind of break through, or the awe that you can feel in nature, or connecting through the arts and so forth. On the other hand, it appeared that if you take only the complex side, you find, well, intellects such as, for instance, Michael Commons, who is a mentor of my own, who doesn't really connect to the spiritual side. I mean, nominally, yes, but he doesn't have that drive, right, or that longing. And the man is very clearly a genius, but at the same time, not what most people, not at all alike most integral people and so forth, right? So there appear to be people who are very different, some more complex thinkers and some more spiritually developed, who are attracted to the same point, to the same value meme, to this being integral, but for very different reasons, right? And they wanted fairly different things, and they needed to be accommodated in very different manners. So in meeting after meeting, the same conflict shows up, right? That people are pulling in the direction of, let's have real content, let's talk about reorganizing the economy, post-capitalist structures and so forth, right? And on the other side, people will say like, no, let's dance, let's embody this, let's not just be in our heads. That's not, we're never going to succeed with anything if we don't ground this in our being and in our relationships and our authenticity and so forth. So, well, okay, why are these two different groups somehow interconnected, right? And that's when, well, as you know, and the listeners may know, is that sometimes it's called modern, postmodern, and meta-modern or integral are called different value memes, right? And that you have certain structure of your personality and your values. So modern would be orange as a color code, and postmodern would be green, and then you have other color codes for later things, right? Like yellow or turquoise. So why weren't the yellow and turquoise people? Well, and what happened, of course, was that everybody will start thinking, well, if this person doesn't agree with me, it means I'm turquoise and they're yellow, or I'm yellow and they're green or something, right? Mm-hmm. Which was also fairly dysfunctional. So I felt, or me and my buddy Emil felt that in order to build the kind of political movement that can host and bridge this divide, you would have to have a clearer model. So we went from what is called value meme, which kind of sounds like it's fairly monolithic. You become orange, you become green, and then you become yellow or turquoise, right? To effective value meme, meaning it's the value meme is going to have different dimensions or different ingredients, and then in effectively speaking, you will still gravitate towards one of these value memes depending on different developmental properties of your own personal development, or the personal development that you have given a certain context that empowers or hinders you. So when we look more closely at that, we noticed, well, okay, so maybe it's more than two dimensions. Maybe it's not just objective cognition and subjective experience or spirituality. Maybe you can actually divide it farther, because even if you look at the complexity side, even if you have, or the cognition side, the cognitive side, let's say you have a genius level person who has a very, very abstract mind, but they simply live in pre-modern Europe, like a historical person, like I think in the book we use Thomas of Aquinas as example. Yeah. And Thomas of Aquinas is a very great medieval luminary, but where would you rate him in this color code, right? Would you say that he is yellow or turquoise because he's so intelligent, or would you say that he's blue, pre-modern, traditional, because he's Catholic, and an Aristotelian, and everything he does is within that framework, or that cosmology, so to speak, in that age? So you kind of have to differentiate between two things. You have to differentiate between the complexity of the organism itself, and the cognitive complexity, and whatever cultural code or language that person has access to through their wider culture. And if you think about it, it has to be that way, because one person, no matter how intelligent, cannot invent a whole universe of concepts and interrelated concepts and models and ways of relating to the world. You're always going to imbue what your culture and the time you live in offers you. So there's a divide right there, and of course there's going to be certain certain interrelations between the two. So if you have high complexity thinkers, they're going to be more likely to, in our day and age, perhaps find their way to more complex forms of code. So they'll pick up on what's the word I'm looking for? Intersectionality, for instance, multivariate analysis. They're likely to pick up on complexity theory from the Santa Fe Institute. They're more likely to pick up developmental theory. They're more likely to view the world more interactively in terms of philosophy. They're likely to be process philosophers, for instance. Rather than Platonists, perhaps. Whereas less complex thinkers are perhaps more attracted to simple dogmatic religions of even pre-modern civilization, whereas the mainstream are likely to pick up the modern, give or take atheist, reductionist, materialist worldview, right? So they interact, but they're two quite distinct different things. So there you have code and complexity. Those would be two different dimensions, but they're both on the side of, and in a sense you could say that one is the hardware, the actual organism with a brain and so forth, and the other is the software, like that brain is operating upon. And very high complexity thinkers can upgrade or elaborate upon some of the software, but most of the time just run some software that we have downloaded from society. Whereas on the spiritual side, there's also difference between very embodied people who have worked through a lot of things and people who are right here and now in a bout of spiritual experience, right? If it happens when people maybe first come across a very inspiring guru or something, they'll report that, well, there was a period or 3 weeks where I felt completely, my mind just went quiet. I just felt crystal clear in the world. I felt in love with existence. Everything felt so cosmically meaningful, so self-evident, so clear. That person's in a high state, right? But then over time, as we age and we have ups and downs of life and we deal with our traumas, etc., we can integrate those different experiences into our more permanent personality. And that's then the concept of depth. And people with higher depth, they can be of the darker depth kind or the lighter depth kind. Lighter depth would be, I've had all of these highs, and I know, even though I'm not in one of those highs right now, I clearly remember it in everyday life. It's not as though it never happened. It's still there. It still informs my everyday action. When I look in the eyes of another person, I can see if the depth with which they meet my gaze has been to those same places, right? Or you can have dark depth on the Freudian side, right? Or I guess Jordan Peterson is an example also of a fairly dark depth intellectual that it's about being able to see the fundamental seriousness of reality that comes from truly having suffered and gotten through it, right? Have been to hell and back, right? So just on a very simple level, you go to a yoga parlor, for instance, and people will have these deep gazes. Some of them will be a little bit hysterical, right? Because maybe they're just following a trend or you're supposed to have those look people deeply in the eye in this yoga parlor, but it's not all for show. There's also something there, right? A kind of sensitivity, a kind of refined, a kind of refined astuteness to detail, to really small subtleties of being together, to being in a room, being in one's body, details of feeling, and also other layers of what it is to be here and now, right? That stuff is a little bit more present, right? So ultimately, the Metamodern project to be successful as a kind of vehicle for societal transformation needs to have a map that respects these these four different dimensions. Some people are going to be in higher states, some people in lower states and just feel, you know, more like everyday life, or usually feels, or feel worse than that, you know, just feel fairly crappy. But that same person can have high complexity and they still have unique value to add. And they can still then, for that same reason, be drawn the same effective value mean. Likewise, you have people with high depth, but they need to be challenged on their magical thinking. The reason they have such magical thinking then is that if life feels, they sense that life is more enchanted than their cognitive models can grasp, then there's always going to be pressure. There's more to life than I can grasp. And you're going to fill that extra space, or that window that opens, with magical thinking. So that's why you can have highly intelligent people, but because they have been on so many psychedelic trips and so forth, they actually still start to believe in some kind of weird magic. And that they've been speaking to you, to aliens on their DMT trips and whatnot, right? Or that they can cast spells across the Atlantic and heal people over the phone and charge people money for that. I mean, they need to be challenged on those assumptions, but the depth they bring to the table, the embodiment, the energy with which they take up space in the world is absolutely essential. And we likely cannot transform society at sufficient depth without those motivations that grow, that are sparked at those levels of the depths of the soul. So you get this four-dimensional picture of what this development really means. Now, likely there are ways to corroborate or falsify this model. First of all, only one of these dimensions has a very strong research agenda behind it. Yes, that would be the complexity. And second of all, you could perhaps change it into a five-dimensional model, etc. I'm not saying this is set in stone, but at least it helps to start to tease apart why integral or metamodern is not one thing. It's a surface phenomena, and then that's going to look very differently depending on who you're talking to, and the decorum or the norms or the modes of engagement in metamodern settings or cultures or spheres need to be aware of the mutual respect that is necessary of these different developmental dimensions, right? And try to balance them out, right? Because a lot of the bad things that happen in the world are due to such developmental imbalances, right? That something maybe well, an obvious example, Western civilization or modernity, it's perhaps a little bit reductionist in its, or more than a little bit reductionist in its view of everything. And for that reason, it becomes manipulative and extractive. And there's even an existential, just like you have magical thinking, which is kind of a pathology, I would argue. You have, or it's not a pathology in indigenous people, for instance, or indigenous cultures, I mean, but it certainly is in these settings, metamodern integralist settings. And likewise, there's the pathology of reductionism, which is you're more complex than you're spiritually developed, which means your mind always sees more than your soul senses, which means everything that seems enchanted, you can explain away. So there's a kind of gap between what you can see and explain and what you sense in the world. So the world seems disenchanted, and you get angry at that gap, right? Because it's not the world childhood or some kind of primordial divinity that we all unconsciously have promised you. You feel that, wait a minute, this is just bullshit. And then you get angry at the world. You want to turn the stones, and you want to reveal the frisky dirt it really is, right? You subtly want to get back at it, right? And what particularly provokes the reductionist mind is that naive thinker, the magical thinker, or the person of metamodern faith that somehow in the mind of the reductionist has sold out truth, sold out your soul to believe in a fairy tale. But actually, the same balance that we can only achieve together is to both explain the world and re-enchant it. And that's the hardest task in the world, but that's why we need each other. And if we do that, I think many of the things that can flow from such a space is can and will be management of complexity and depth out there in the world, meaning resolving the deeper problems of modernity, right? So in a sense, tackling this this multidimensional imbalance of development in us is also a utopian project, or I don't want to use the word utopian here. I'm writing an article here about using the term protopian rather than utopian, but it's a project that has to do with saving the world. It's not as trivial as it might seem, right? It's not about boxing people and just describing people for fun, or